Hi everybody, welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, as it is every week, and here we are again with another story. This time we are delving into more of this book of Irish fairy and folktales. The thing that's really interesting that I discovered about this book is that it's actually broken up into sections. So we have like fairies, we have something called solitary fairies, we have ghosts, we have witches and saints. So I thought it would be good to take a few stories from each of these chapters and read them for you. So I know that we just did banshees, but I would really like to start at the beginning and talk about fairies. So before we get into the story, there's a little tiny introduction about what fairies are to native people of Ireland. So I'd like to read that for you. There's going to be a lot of words in here that I'm sure I'm pronouncing incorrectly. I tried to look them up sometime. We're gonna see what happens. But let's get into the explanation of the trooping fairies. The Irish word for fairy is sheohog, or traditionally spelled a very different way. A diminutive of she in banshee. Fairies are Danishi, or fairy people. So who are they? Fallen angels who are not good enough to be saved, nor bad enough to be lost, say the peasantry. The gods of the earth, says the Book of Armagh. The gods of pagan Ireland, say the Irish antiquarians. The Tuatha De Danann, who, when no longer worshipped and fed with offerings, dwindled away in the popular imagination and are now only a few spans high. And they will tell you in proof that the names of fairy chiefs are the names of old Danann heroes, and the places where they especially gather together, Danann burying places, and the Tuatha De Danann, used also to be called the Slua Shi, the fairy host, or the Marcra Shi, the fairy cavalcade. On the other hand, there is much evidence to prove them fallen angels. Witness the nature of the creatures, their caprice, their way of being good to the good and evil to the evil, having every charm but conscience, consistency. Beings so quickly offended that you must speak much about them at all. You must not speak much about them at all, and never call them anything but the gentry, or else Doween Maith, which in English means good people, get so easily pleased they will do their best to keep misfortune away from you, if you leave a little milk for them on the windowsill overnight. On the whole, the popular belief tells us most about them, telling us how they fell and yet were not lost, because their evil was wholly without malice. Are they the gods of the earth? Perhaps. Many poets and all mystic and occult writers in all ages and countries have declared that behind the visible are chains on chains of conscious beings, who are not of heaven but of earth, who have no inherent form but change according to their whim, or mind that sees them. You cannot lift your hand without influencing and being influenced by hordes. The visible world is merely their skin. In dreams we go amongst them and play with them or combat with them. They are perhaps human souls in the crucible, these creatures of whim. Do not think the fairies were always little. Everything is capricious about them, even their size. They seem to take what size or shape pleases them. Their chief occupations are feasting, fighting, and making love, and playing the most beautiful music. They have only one industrious person among them, the leprechaun, the shoemaker. Perhaps they wear their shoes out with dancing. Near the village of Ballisodare there is a little woman who lived amongst them 7 years. When she came home she had no toes, she had danced them off. They have 3 great festivals in the year: May Eve, Midsummer Eve, November Eve. On May Eve, every 7th year, they fight all round, but mostly on the plain of Bon, wherever that is, for the harvest, for the best ears of grain belong to them. An old man told me he saw them fight once. They tore the thatch off a house in midst of it all. Had anyone else been near them, they would merely have seen a great wind whirling everything into the air as it passed. When the wind makes the straw and leaves whirl as it passes, that is the fairies, and the peasantry takes off their hats and says, God bless them. On Midsummer Eve, when the bonfires are lighted on every hill honor of St. John, the fairies are at their gayest and sometimes steal away beautiful mortals to be their brides. On November Eve, they are the gloomiest, for, according to the old Gaelic reckoning, this is the first night of winter. This night they dance with the ghosts, and the puka is abroad, and witches make their spells, and girls set a table with food in the name of the devil, that the fetch of their future lover may come through the window to eat the food. After November Eve, the blackberries are no longer wholesome, for the puka has spoiled them. When they are angry, they paralyze men and cattle with their fairy darts. When they are gay, they sing. Many a poor girl has heard them and pined away and died for love of that singing. Plenty of the old beautiful tunes of Ireland are only their music, caught by eavesdroppers. No wise peasant would hum the pretty girl milking the cow near a fairy rath, for they are jealous and do not like to hear their songs on the lips of clumsy mortals. Carolan, the last of the Irish bards, slept on the rath, and ever after the fairy tunes rang in his head and made him the great man that he was. And that's a small introduction to what the Irish people consider what fairies are. There are so many interpretations of fairies, in so many different cultures around the world. The culture that I belong to, well, I don't know if I could really characterize it to any mortal interpretation, I'm not gonna lie, but it's very interesting to see what kind of fae lived among humans from the perspectives of one culture in particular. So I'm really excited to delve more into this. So, the story that I'm going to read now is called The Legend of Knocksheogowna. And Tipperary is one of the most singularly shaped hills in the world. It has got the peak on top like a conical nightcap thrown carelessly over your head as you awake in the morning. On the very point is built a sort of lodge, where in the summer the lady who built it and her friends used to go on parties of pleasure, but that was long after the days of fairies, and it is, I believe, now deserted. But before the lodge was built, or acre sown, there was close to the head of a hill a large pasturage, where a herdsman spent his days and nights among the herd. The spot had been an old fairy ground, and the good people were angry that the scene of their light and airy gambols should be trampled by the rude hooves and bulls of cows. The lowing of the cattle sounded sad in their ears, and the chief of the fairies of the hill determined in person to drive away their newcomers, and the way she thought of it was this. When the harvest nights came on, and the moon shone bright and brilliant over the hill, and the cattle were lying down hushed and quiet, the herdsman wrapped in his mantle was musing, with his heart gladdened by the glorious company of the stars twinkling above him. Bathed in the flood of light bursting all over the sky, she would come and dance before him, now in one shape, now in another, but all ugly and frightful to behold. One time she would be a great horse, with the wings of an eagle and the tail like a dragon, hissing loud and spitting fire. Then in a moment she would change into a little man, lame of a leg, with a bull's head and a lambent flame playing around it. Then into a great ape with duck's feet and a turkey cock's tail. But I should be all day about it were I to tell you the shapes that she took. And then she would roar, or neigh, or hiss, or bellow, or howl, or hoot, as never yet was roaring, neighing, hissing, bellowing, howling, or hooting, heard in this world before or since. The poor herdsman would cover his face and call on the saints for help, but it was no use. With one puff of her breath she would blow away the fold of his great coat, let him hold it ever so tightly over his eyes, and not a saint in heaven could have paid him the slightest attention. And to make matters worse, he never could stir, nor even shut his eyes, but there he was, obliged to say, held by what power he knew not, gazing at these terrible sights, until the hair of his head would lift his hat half a foot above his crown, and his teeth would be ready to fall out from chattering. But the cattle would scamper about mad as if they were bitten by the fly, and this would last until the sun rose over the hill. The poor cattle, from want of rest, were pining away, and the food did them no good. Besides, they met with accidents without end. Never a night passed that some of them did not fall into a pit and get maimed or maybe killed. Some of them would tumble into a river and be drowned. In a word, there seemed never to be an end of the accidents. But what made the matter worse is that there could not be a herdsman got to tend the cattle by night. One visit from the fairy drove out the stoutest-hearted almost mad. The owner of the ground did not know what to do. He offered double, treble, quadruple wages, but not a man could be found for the sake of money to go through the horrid facing of the fairy. She rejoiced at the successful issue of her project and continued her pranks. The herd gradually thinning and no man daring to remain on the ground, the fairies came back in numbers and gambled as merrily as before, quaffing dewdrops from acorns and spreading their feast on the head of capacious mushrooms. What was to be done? The puzzled farmer thought in vain. He found that his substance was daily diminishing, his people terrified, and his rent day coming around. It's no wonder that he looked gloomy and walked mournfully down the road. Now in that part of the world dwelt a man of the name of Larry Houlihan, who played on the pipes better than any other player within 15 parishes. A roving, dashing blade was Larry, and feared nothing. Give him plenty of liquor and he would defy the devil. He would face a mad bull or fight single-handed against a fair. In one of his gloomy walks the farmer met him, and on Larry's asking the cause of his down looks, he told him all of his misfortunes. "If that's all that ails you," said Larry, "make your mind easy. Were there as many friends on Knocksheogowna as there are potato blossoms in Eliogurdy, I would face them. It would be a queer thing indeed if I, who never was afraid of a proper man, should turn my back upon a brat of a fairy not the bigness of one's thumb." "Larry," said the farmer, "do not talk so bold, for you do not know who is hearing you. But if you make your words good and watch my herds for a week on top of the mountain, your hand shall be free of my dish till the sun has burnt itself out to the bigness of a farthing rushlight." The bargain was struck, and Larry went to the hilltop when the moon began to peep over the brow. He had been regaled at the farmer's house and was bold to extract the barley corn. So he took a seat on a big stone under the hollow of the hill and his back to the wind and pulled out his pipes. He had not played long when the voice of the fairies was heard upon the blast, like a low stream of music. Presently they burst out into a loud laugh, and Larry could plainly hear one say, "What? Another man upon the fairies' ring? Go to him, Queen, and make him repent his rashness." And they flew away. Larry felt them pass by his face as they flew like a swarm of midges, and looking up hastily, he saw between the moon and him a great black cat standing on the very tip of its claws, with its back up and mewing with the voice of a watermill. Presently, it swelled up towards the sky, and turning round on its left hind leg, whirled till it fell to the ground, from which it started to the shape of a salmon with a cravat around its neck and a pair of new top boots. "Go on, Jewel," said Larry. "If you dance, I'll pipe." And he struck up. So she turned into this and that and the other, but still Larry played on, as well as he knew how. At last she lost patience, as ladies will when you do not mind their scolding, and changed herself into a calf, milk-white as the cream of cork, and with eyes as mild as those of a girl I love. She came up gentle and fawning, in hopes to throw him off his guard by quietness, and then to work him some wrong. But Larry was not so deceived, for when she came up, he, dropping his pipes, leaped upon her back. Now from the top of Knocksheogowna, as you look westward to the broad Atlantic, you will see the Shannon, queen of the rivers, spreading like a sea, and running on in gentle course to mingle with the ocean through the fair city of Limerick. It on this night shone under the moon, and looked beautiful from the distant hill. 50 boats were gliding up and down on the sweet current, and the song of the fishermen rose gaily from the shore. Larry, as I said before, leaped upon the back of the fairy, and she, rejoiced at the opportunity, sprung him from the hilltop and bounded clear at one jump over the Shannon, flowing as it was just 10 miles from the mountain's base. It was done in a second, and when she alighted on the distant bank, kicking up her heels, she flung Larry on the soft turf. No sooner was he thus planted than he looked her straight in the face, and scratching his head cried out, "By my word, well done! That was not a bad leap for a calf." She looked at him for a moment, and then assumed her own shape. "Lawrence," said she, "you're a bold fellow. Will you come back the way you went?" "And that's what I will," said he, "if you let me." So changing into a calf again, Larry got on her back, and at another bound they were again on top of Knocksheogowna. The fairy, once more resuming her figure, addressed him. "You've shown much courage, Lawrence," said she, "that while you keep herds on this hill you shall never be molested by me or mine. The day dawns. Go down to the farmer hut and tell him this, and if anything I can do may be of service to you, ask and you shall have it." She vanished accordingly, and kept her word in never visiting the hill during Larry's life. but he never troubled her with requests. He piped and drank at the farmer's expense and roosted his chimney corner, occasionally casting his eye to the flock. He died at last, and is buried in a green valley of pleasant Tipperary. But whether the fairies returned to the hill of Knocksheogowna after his death is more than I can say. And that was The Legend of Knocksheogowna. I hope I said that right. I probably did not. Well, that was a cute story. I really do find it interesting, the different types of magic that mortals' perspectives of fairies can have, because shapeshifting is definitely a very popular one that you see in classic folklore in general. But it really is so interesting. Just reading stories from the perspectives of one point of view. It's also interesting because in Ireland, religion has become such a very big part of their culture. So there's pagans in Ireland, and then of course there's Christians in Ireland, and they all they're both Christian and pagan lore have kind of melded together to create, new versions of these mythical creatures and these stories. So Christianity has a huge part in shaping the perspective of most people's interpretations of fairies, whether they are of the devil, for example, or whether they are just gods of the earth from another perspective. So it is really interesting, and I'm very curious to see how that also influences other stories as well. So I hope that you enjoyed that. I think it's very interesting, and I look very much forward to reading more stories from this book. So thank you so much for joining me for another story. I hope that you're all staying happy, healthy, and safe, and I'll see you next week.